You're listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Welcome along to another Straight to Video podcast. I'm your host, Rob Lane, and I gotta say, I had a blast talking to today's guest on the show, guitarist and songwriter Mr. Ben Christo. Since 2006, Ben has been the guitarist for gothic rock post-punk band The Sisters of Mercy, but during that time, he also formed the band Night by Night, and more recently in 2016, he established the band Diamond Black. This was the first time Ben and I had ever spoken, despite having an endless amount of mutual good friends, so it was a lot of fun to connect, particularly as I learned we both got into rock music around a similar time, Ben being down in Bristol whilst I was up in Nottingham, but we both fell in love with the melodic hard rock bands of the late 80s and early 90s, and yes, I know I often talk about it a lot on this podcast, but we both saw that huge change in the early part of the 1990s when our favourite style of music suddenly went out of favour just as we were heavily submerging ourselves into it. Around that time, Ben would gravitate towards new styles which ticked the boxes of what he enjoyed. Luckily, bands such as the Wild Arts, Terrorvision, The Almighty, bands with big guitars and somewhat melodic edge kept rock music ticking over. Brit rock, let's call it, and eventually he would find his place towards the end of the decade with his band Echo, which enabled him to break out of the Bristol music scene into the larger picture. This would set him up for a career that has now taken him all over the world. But I didn't want to talk all about his rock and roll adventures around the globe. I wanted to take things right back to the beginning as we do on the Straight to Video podcast and see what shaped this guy to enable him to do all that. We had an absolute blast talking all about his school days, his early passions for music, and a love for an era of rock and roll which is obvious from our talk still means a lot to him today. I want to shout to our mutual friend Alan Howell for hooking us up and suggesting we should have a chat as we'd have a lot to talk about, and the guy wasn't wrong. If you enjoy this interview and want to learn more about Ben, then please visit www.diamondblackofficial.com, where his band have a killer website with links to all their social media, videos, a great merch store, and a lot more. But right now, let's dive into our chat with Sisters of Mercy and Diamond Black guitarist Ben Christo. You started playing music super early, right? 7 years old.
Yeah, I started playing the piano and I just wasn't into it at all. It was one of those classic your parents get you to do it things. And it was so much maths in my head involved in terms of the notation and just learning these meaningless little tunes that I felt like it was a huge chore. But I did it, I guess, for a couple of months. Then I lost interest in it because I think as a kid, you need to instantly be able to connect the thing you're doing to something bigger and something greater. And it wasn't possible for me to, even at that time when I was 7, I was still I was listening to, it was very early days of me listening to rock music, and I couldn't connect what I was doing to that. So I sort of lost interest, but it sort of had a good foundation for me when I actually started playing the guitar a few years later, because I've had some kind of musical background. And my understanding of music theory is I could probably know something from one of every grade, but I could never do an exam in any of the grades, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get you.
And so I learned mostly I learn by ear. That's how I pick things up, and that's how I write things and how I learn things. And I found it really useful having that kind of ear, especially as time's gone on, because often I've been given music. It's right, you've got to learn this by tomorrow. And just by listening, rather than desperately looking for some notation on the internet that might be wrong, I've been able to figure things out. And also quite good at hearing different parts within music as well, which maybe I wouldn't have pushed myself so much to do if I'd been able to read. Particularly when figuring out vocal harmonies and things, being able to pick apart the different areas within the sound is really helpful. But no real academic background other than bits and pieces I picked up here and there that have been helpful. So when people say, oh, you shouldn't learn music at all because then it takes away from the organic nature of it, I think that's wrong. And I also think that anyone who says that you have to do it by the book, I think there's a nice middle ground in between where you can take bits of each and bring them together. Although, of course, people have been hugely successful doing either way 100% as well. Just my own experience of it is that a nice balance of both I find really helpful. So it is a lot to do with listening. And yet if someone comes in and says, oh, that's a minor third, I know what they're talking about.
Right. Gotcha. You got to find what works for you. You've got to, music is there to be enjoyed as well. So you don't want to find it a slog.
Exactly. And I was very fortunate in the sense that my first guitar was an electric guitar. And it wasn't like a little mini electric guitar. It was a full-sized electric guitar. So it meant that from day one, I could instantly start trying to sound like the artists I wanted to sound like, which at that time was principally AC/DC, Judas Priest, Def Leppard, The Cult, that sort of thing.
Is that the kind of music that attracted you originally? Like at the time you was playing the piano and you wasn't into it because it wasn't sounding like what you were listening to. Was you listening to that kind of stuff?
Well, I remember that even the very first few pieces of music I heard, of popular music I heard, I was always drawn towards the more guitar-orientated ones. So even if that was like, there was a track on a Michael Jackson album that had heavy guitars on it, that would be my favorite one. So like Beat It or Dirty Diana or something, right? And I found that I was really drawn towards that. So even like in the theme tune to the A-Team, there's like a heavy bit, and that was always my favorite bit. So It was very organically developed that I was drawn towards the heavier guitar-orientated sort of side of popular music, which obviously as I grew up became more and more, developed more and more into the different subgenres. But yeah, so starting off, I've got an uncle who's only 8 years older than me, so he was a bit like a big brother. And he was the one who introduced me to pretty much everything back then that I liked musically, films, books, because I just looked up to him so much.
What was he into?
He was into, like, initially he was into, the first thing I remember him getting me into was Nick Kershaw, of all things. Like, even then, there were a few, like, Nick Kershaw songs that had quite heavy guitars on, and those were the ones I really liked. And then after that, it was Def Leppard, which then, that was like the real first mainstay of interests for me. And I became absolutely obsessed with them, I think, between the ages of 7 and maybe 11. Went down to the local shop. We had a shop called Rival Records. And I'm not sure if that was just an independent store in Bristol, but it was one of those ones where they had all the patches and the T-shirts and the pins and the badges.
They're the best ones.
The best ones, yeah, right? And you'd go in there and you'd have no idea what you were going to get. But I made it my absolute mission to try and get every possible Def Leppard patch I could and get my mum to sew them onto this terrible stonewashed denim jacket that I've still got.
Is that the one which is in a photograph on your Facebook from 1991?
Yes, where every single patch on the back is Def Leppard, apart from one Metallica one. And I didn't even really know what it was, but it looked cool.
Just like the logo, nice pointy logo.
Exactly, yeah. Had I have heard Master of Puppets at the time, I probably would have been like, what's this? It's way too heavy.
That's back in the time when people used to get scared of music. I used to be terrified of like anything which was a little bit too heavy. It's like, oh no, it's a little bit scary, that is. That's when Ozzy was scary and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right. The 4 core bands for me, the 4 main bands that set me up were Def Leppard, Cult, AC/DC and Judas Priest when I was between those ages of, say, 7 and 11, 12. And in 1990, Priest brought out Painkiller. And the only real Priest stuff I'd heard before that through my uncle was the Turbo album and a few things off Ram It Down. And that stuff is still, you know, it's still heavy metal, but it's very melodic. It's super melodic and lots of like catchy choruses and harmonies. And Painkiller was like the heaviest thing I'd ever heard. And the worst thing about it was that I'd gone and bought this 7-inch vinyl, but I didn't have a vinyl player.
Right.
So I had to go around to Grampy's house, who had a vinyl player, and say, Grampy, can you put this on a tape for me? So Grampy takes this vinyl, and I've got no idea what to expect. And imagine my horror when it's like the heaviest thing I've ever heard. And that kind of like, when you're a kid, how you're so scared of what your elders might think of you. And me being like, oh my God, Grampy's going to think I'm like a Satanist or something, taping off the vinyl for me. And yeah, it was just like, this is the heaviest thing I've ever heard. But like initially, it was those 4 or 5 bands, also the early sort of Bon Jovi stuff as well, that really got me into it. And when I had that first guitar, it was a Sun Mustang, which was a like a Fender Strat copy.
Do you remember where it was from? or who you had to ask to get it?
My parents did this brilliant trick that I'm not sure if other parents did, where you'd open your presents and there'd be that one thing you really wanted and it wasn't there. And they'd be like, right, that's it. That's the end of the presents. And you'd be like, okay, trying to put a brave face on, trying to look happy, trying to look like grateful. And then, oh, Ben, can you come in the back room? We've got to move some boxes and stuff. And then you go in and there's the big present.
Was this a Christmas or a birthday?
This was a Christmas. I think I was 10 and it was the electric guitar. And even back then, I didn't say anything, but I remember being slightly disappointed that it was a Strat because my favourite guitarist was Steve Clark of Def Leppard and he played a Les Paul. And that was the kind of shape or an SG, like an Angus thing. So those were the shapes that I kind of, for me, were iconic of what I wanted to do. But still, it was an electric guitar. And the first amp that I had didn't even have distortion on it. It was like some old secondhand thing they'd got. It was a WEM, which is one of those like really big old amps that looks like a piece of furniture. And it didn't have any distortion on it. And if you wanted any distortion on it, you had to turn it up to as high as it would possibly go. But then it was so loud, I had to put it under mattresses so that it wouldn't be too much of a disturbance. And it was like an absolute revelation when I got a distortion pedal called the Metal Maniac. Of course they were. It was like fluorescent green. That suddenly I could have like the tone that I really believed I wanted. So those were sort of the first musical steps for me in terms of what I was listening to, and then how that sort of became part of who I was. And for those first couple of years of playing guitar, I absolutely loved it. I'd like run home from school, like can't wait to play the guitar. And I think for any kids growing up, that kind of relationship to the instrument is what's important. It's like it's a toy. It's because you're so excited about it. And I got known in school as like in primary school as the kid who plays guitar.
I was going to say, that's still very young, like 10, 11 years old. Well, getting passionate about something like that.
Yeah, and I remember it was really all consuming. And when I went to secondary school, I went to this awful comprehensive that I'm sure most people went to, like just this really terrible comprehensive where it's just full of people who don't like alternative music at all. And I had long hair as well, which got bullied a lot for that. Everyone said I looked like a girl, and I did.
I've said to a few people, did that ever really bother you? Because it never bothered me, because I love the fact that I was kind of, well, in my head anyway, I was starting to look like the people I had on posters and stuff like that. I was like, say whatever you want, but I think I look cool. Did it ever bother you, or how thick-skinned was you with it?
It was really half and half, because as much as I didn't like being bullied and marginalized and segregated, I also couldn't imagine cutting my hair, because that would be the ultimate betrayal of everything that I believed in. And I remember the first day I walked into school, I think like something had happened whereby I came to the school slightly later than everybody else in the first year. I can't remember why it was, but some reason why I came in late. I walked into the tutor room, and the first thing this girl at the back said as I walked in was like, "Who the fuck is that?" Right? And that was the opening gambit of my time in Filton High School, because I had long hair, and it was like, what is this? This was the time where everyone was getting like Nike logos shaved into the side of their heads. Stuff, and like listening to Two Unlimited.
Yeah.
and the one redeeming thing that happened was that on the very first Christmas in year 7, when I guess I was 10 or 11 or something, they did a Christmas talent show for the first years. And it seemed like no one really knew what they were doing. Like some people would get up and sing Jingle Bells with a bit of like tinsel. And there seemed to be a plan, but I had a plan. My plan was I was going to go up the front and I was going to play Johnny Be Good, just like Marty McFly in Back to the Future. So I had this plan. My friend Ben Taylor helped me. So we had a backing track that I'd recorded on a cassette, got one of those like really awful, massive tape recorders that looked like a block of wood with like the kind of faux paneling on them that was like from 1963 or something. And that was the backing. And so I played all of Johnny Be Good. I didn't sing, but I like played it and did like little licks and stuff over the backing track. And then at the very end of it, the backing track stopped and I did this like two-handed tapping solo thing. And then and I finished, and it was like a moment of silence, and then just the room erupted into applause.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I'd ever felt like I'd been in any way accepted or appreciated for something that I really was passionate about. And for a couple of weeks after that, I didn't get bullied quite as much.
I was going to say, did that change the dynamic?
It did for a short time, because the residual memory was still there. And I remember a couple of kids coming up to me, being like, "Here, mate, you fucking queer or something, you a boy or a girl?" Like the usual kind of bullying, awful Bristolian horror. And his mate goes, no, he's all right. He's really good on the electronic guitar.
Yes.
So for a couple of weeks, they sort of backed off a bit, but then it all became back to normal. That was really transformative for me, because I realized that being passionate about something even if I didn't realize it in these so many words at the time, being passionate about something gains you the respect of others and gives you some sort of purpose and a place, and sort of carried that on through school. And I remember when I was about 13, right about that time when you start becoming really obsessed with people that you fancy. And there was a girl in, I think in my history class or whatever. Anyway, I noticed that she was like one of the very, very few girls in our school who liked alternative music. Never spoken to her, but of course I was in love with her.
Yes.
And she had a Smashing Pumpkins badge, right? I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. I'd never heard them, but I could tell it was like an alternative band, or maybe I'd seen somewhere in a t-shirt or whatever. So somehow I got hold of a Smashing Pumpkins tape and I learned how to play one of the songs, just on the off chance that at some point I might be in a room with her, with a guitar, and I'd be able to play it.
That's kid logic, that is.
It is. And I remember even like the patheticness of standing outside history with her like in front of me in the queue, in the line. We'd never spoken. And me sort of humming some of this Smashing Pumpkins song, hoping she'd look round. But fortune had it that at some point during a music lesson, or sometimes like at lunchtime, you could go into the music room, weird like school things. And I remember for whatever reasons, there was the opportunity for me to play the guitar and play the song. And I remember she was like mildly impressed and then never really spoke to me again. But nevertheless,
I love that.
We'd had that moment.
I can relate to that. I had a friend who, when we went to college, I think it was one of the first days in photography, everybody had to line up and got partnered with somebody. And my friend got partnered with this like hot blonde girl. And after the lesson had finished, he came up to me. He was like, she loves the band White Lion. I know you like White Lion. Can you lend me one of their albums so I can tape it? So I know some of the songs for next time. It's that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Because that was our currency. Music was our currency. And it enabled us to have value. It enabled us to interact with each other. And I totally get where you're coming from there, that you had to learn those White Lion songs. It was a really strange time. Because when I first started, the aim was that you had to become a real shredder guitar player.
Mm-hmm.
It was the apex of that stuff, almost to the point where it was just getting too stupid and too oversaturated, which is, I guess, why the whole thing sort of backfired. Well, not backfired, but sort of where there was a revolution. And so I was buying magazines like Guitar Techniques and things where it was all about shredding.
Who were your guys? Was it like Angus and Steve Clark?
Angus and Steve Clark and Billy Duffy and Glenn Tipton and Richie Sambora. I say those are my principal influences. Though Duffy and Clark and Angus to some degree were a lot more about feel and melody than they were about technicality. And what I love about Glenn Tipton was that in Priest was that his solos had so much melody in them. And then when he did do a bit of shred, it was quite tasteful and accurate and imaginative. And same sort of thing with Sambora. He could play really fast, but he used it very, very strategically. And so I was like, the only way I can ever be a good guitar player is to be able to shred. That's just what I'm being told by what's around me. And I sort of got very disillusioned with it because I just found it too difficult to play in that way, that very technical, mathematical way. Because again, maths and science were always very weak subjects for me. And it came back to the 7-year-old piano playing again of this is like maths. And so I remember feeling quite disillusioned, and someone lent me an Yngwie Malmsteen instructional video, which was the most demotivating thing I think I've ever seen, because he'd play some like massive shred lick and he'd be like, and now I do it really slow, and then play it like the same. And it was just like, this is it, I'm never going to be good. And I guess fortunately for me at that particular time, that type of playing began to fall out of favor, and it became a lot more about, well, it kind of went a bit too far the other way for my liking with some of the way that the kind of the grunge and the indie music developed. But I then found my place, because I found that what I actually liked doing was not necessarily sitting down and learning how to play Phrygian mode at a billion BPM. It was writing little songs. That became my interest. And the first song that I ever wrote it was called The Devil's Flaming Hoof.
Wow.
Right? This was actually a little bit before. This was like one of the first things I ever wrote when I picked up a guitar, because I was so massively influenced by AC/DC at the time. So I remember another song that I wrote was called Devil and Damnation.
I see a theme.
Yeah, exactly. We sounded exactly like Evil Walks by AC/DC. I can actually play you The Devil's Flaming Hoof right now, because I can remember it. So if you can hear this. Right, I'm going to get a pick to do this properly. So when I wrote this, I think I was about, I don't know, I'd probably been playing for about 6 months or something. This is The Devil's Flaming Hoof. I won't play the whole thing. I'll play you just the verse and the chorus, okay? It goes... There he is, behind you. He's gonna get you with his flaming hoof. He makes flames to the roof. But watch out for the devil's flaming hoof. But what? That's the idea, right?
Following like the Ozzy Osbourne paranoid of like vocal melody mimics the riff.
Is the same as the riff, yeah. So yeah, that was pretty good. And the follow-up was Devil and Damnation, which was exactly the same as AC/DC's Evil Walks, which went Devil and Damnation, Devil and Damnation, Devil and Damnation. It's like I'm taking a trip to Hell Station. Hell Station.
The melody had grown, though. You could see progress.
Exactly.
Definite progress.
Development, yeah. There was definitely some development there. So those are the first couple of songs. And then after that, I became really, really obsessed with anything to do with the cult. So I would then write songs that were all very much like Rain, Firewoman, those kind of like 3-4 chords, then with like a melody going over the top of it, like a little guitar lick and a vocal hook as well. So that's something that I've carried on, I think, all my life with music. Is like, I always think a chorus should have a little motif, a little kind of melodic motif, and a vocal line as well. So you've got like 2 hooks in that same chorus. So this is sort of counter melody thing. And that was the time when I'd write entire albums, mostly just in my head, but actually make the inlay card and the cassette and the artwork and write down like where it was recorded and the length of the songs and stuff like that. And even though it was just like one copy. And I had a very primitive way of recording music, which was that you had 2 tape recorders, one which was mine and one which was my stepdad's that I secretly borrowed when he didn't know about it. I hope he's not listening. And what I'd do is that on tape recorder 1, you would record the rhythm guitar and the main vocal. And then you play that back whilst recording the second part. And then the second tape recorder is recording both the original tape recorder and me singing the backing vocals and the lead guitar.
Where do you think you learned that from? Just made sense to you, or?
Just made sense. It just made sense of that was sort of the logic of how to multi-track. And sometimes my brother would help me by like pressing start on the keyboard drums, and so that every song would start the same, like.
So what is it? You got brothers and sisters? You've got a sister as well, right?
Yeah, I've got a younger sister and a younger brother and an elder brother as well. And I actually recently, in the last few years, discovered that I've got another older sister from my dad and a different mother who I never met. And so that's been quite interesting, like meeting a completely new sister, and she's got kids. So I'm now like an uncle, and
awesome, man.
That's been really cool. Yeah.
Excellent. So what was the dynamic between your brothers and sisters? Did you all get on pretty well?
Got on really well with my older brother because he's about just under 2 years older than me. And so we both were influenced a lot by this same uncle. So my brother was drawn a lot more towards the book side of things, and I was drawn a lot more towards the music side. My brother's now like he's like a published author, and he does books about climate change and stuff like that. He's a really cool guy, and he's done like so much great work for things to do with equal rights and for the environment and for people and stuff. So we had so much in common, but we also clashed a lot because it was almost like he was this super intelligent bumbling wizard and I was this sort of like hot-headed warrior. You know, if it was some sort of like fantasy novel where I wanted to go out like with my sword and doing adventures, and he wanted to stay at home and like write spells.
Where did you meet? Where did you meet in the middle? Over favourite films or TV shows or anything like that? Yeah,
I'd say there were a number of things that we met on. We always really bonded over comedy stuff. A lot of like the comedy stuff when we were growing up was Blackadder and Red Dwarf, which I still really love now, and I'll go back and watch it. It's brilliant. And the young ones and stuff like that. And comedy films as well, like a lot of the like Leslie Nielsen stuff and Airplane. And there's a film called UHF that had Weird Al Yankovic in it that we watched about 1,000 times. You know, when you're that age and you just quote stuff and you'll walk to school and you'll quote it together and that kind of thing, like the back of maths, like doing scenes from it.
And the most obscure films will be like the biggest films in the world to you as well. most people have probably never heard of UHF before,
Exactly, yeah.
To you, it was like, everyone knows of UHF.
How you'd found these things was usually some sort of accident that some mate had lent you or something, and then that had been on the end of it and he'd forgotten it was there, or it was always that kind of like strange vibe. And so we really bonded on that stuff, and we bonded a lot on books as well, the kind of swords and sorcery fantasy books like Tolkien stuff, and Michael Moorcock was a good one, and the fighting fantasy books as well. Remember the ones that you choose your own adventure in? And
I was just about to say choose your own adventure stuff, yeah.
So we bonded a lot on that stuff. I think we massively frustrated each other as well, because I was so like reactionary and hot-headed, and he was so measured and geeky, basically nerdy, and we had to share a bedroom for pretty much the entire time growing up. So you can imagine how frustrating that is with a sibling, to the point where we actually somehow made a curtain barrier that went down the middle of this very, very small room, and I'd somehow manipulated it so that I had all the space.
I gotta say, couldn't you like do it so your Kerrang posters made the divider? You could have perhaps done that.
Yeah, actually, yeah. And that was another thing. It was like my side of the room was just completely Kerrang posters. He had pictures from his Tolkien calendar of like Galadriel and Council of Elrond and stuff. And yeah, we really contrasted, but we were very close, and we still are.
Love that. Did you start attracting like-minded people who are into music at school to allow you to start looking at putting bands together?
I think this is one of the most important things, was that it was really tricky for me because there was such a quick musical shift between the years of about 92 and 94. In 92, you could still like Firehouse and glam rock and Danger Danger and Def Leppard. In 94, you couldn't. And so just the time when I was really getting into all that music, it suddenly became grossly unfashionable. And so I was going to school, and although I was still had on my headphones like Winger and was doing my paper round to Def Leppard and Damn Yankees and stuff, all of the people who liked alternative music, like Smashing Pumpkins, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam. And I don't know if there's ever been a time in music where there's been such a quick shift.
Especially not, let's call it like just one style of music. A new kind of music has come in or become popular. But for rock fans, if you're a rock fan, you suddenly weren't allowed to listen to a certain type of rock music.
Yeah, and that's why there's so many of these bands that are great bands. They bring out an album in 92 and it's probably one of the best things they ever did. And then they sort of weirdly do this album in 94, 95 where they're suddenly wearing plaid shirts and they're not quite sure what they're doing. And what I think is really telling is if you watch the Wayne's World movies, particularly the second one, it falls right in the middle of that change. So there's the bit where he goes, who's playing a Woodstock? Aerosmith and Pearl Jam. And you've got two bands there that are quite diametrically opposite in the sense of like Aerosmith is a hair metal band, Pearl Jam is a full-on grunge band. Yet they're both at that point still acceptable. Garth has got an Aerosmith t-shirt, but he's got the rest of him's quite Nirvana in terms of his shirt and his quite baggy ripped jeans and stuff. And it was such a weird time. So what happened was that I was still really into all this 80s music in 93, 94, 95, but no one else was. And I remember people who were alternative actively laughing at me because I still listened to that music. And so it meant that even the alternative crowd thought I was lame.
It's like, I can't win here.
Couldn't win. So there was no one. I felt like there was no one on the planet who would understand where I was coming from, because what I liked was just so anachronistic and so out of step. I remember my mum saying to me once, said something like, it wasn't even about music. She said something like, well, over in those Eastern European places, they're 10 years behind. I remember thinking, I'd love to go there. Maybe they still like Winger. And it was such a troubling time because I just didn't feel like I could really fit in. And the reason was that there was so little way for me to hear and see new music. And the bits and pieces I did, you just pick up, like maybe there'd be a band on TFI Friday or something on the chart show where they had the rock chart once every 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to wait for it. You might see something, but principally things were either like too limp and like lame and like Ocean Colour Scene's Moseley Shoals, or it was like way too far the other way. It was this really kind of brutal, burn my eyes, machine head, ultra masculine music. And I couldn't seem to find anything in the middle. So there was this really weird period between like, I says 93 and 95, 96 even, where I just didn't fit in with anyone. And I had to sort of almost hide what I liked because there wasn't like a scene I could be a part of without being ridiculed.
Was you seeing any gigs at this time, or had you been to many gigs?
First two gigs I ever went to were Judas Priest and AC/DC in 1991. That had a massively fundamental effect on who I became. As you can imagine, being that sort of age and seeing the sort of show that Priest would have put on followed very quickly by AC/DC, Angus.
Was that Razor's Edge time?
It was, yeah. And they both brought out almost like comeback albums for both bands. Even though I actually really love Blow Up Your Video and Ram It Down, I think publicly speaking, Razor's Edge and Painkiller were seen as the big comeback albums for both those bands and like some of their best records. So it was like, you can imagine the excitement surrounding the bands and being that age and going to a stadium, seeing like Angus on a raised podium in the middle of the audience, throwing out this Angus money everywhere, Brian swinging on the bell. And it was life-changing. And I always remember those gigs being like very close to each other, where the reality was, I think they were about 2 months apart. Because I actually looked it up the other day. I was like, when was that? The first one was the 24th of March, 91. The second one was actually, the AC/DC was actually in April. But I remember them sort of being in the same week.
That's how time what seems to work nowadays. It's crazy.
Yeah. And also so little happens to you when you're that age that it all seemed part of the same sort of exciting moment.
Who did you go with? Did your uncle take you?
I went with Uncle John. I went with Uncle Jonathan. Yeah. So that was super exciting because it wasn't like I was going with mum and dad who didn't really get it. It was like going with someone who really understood. That was super exciting. And I don't think I went to another gig after that until 95, which is when the only time I ever bunked off school was to go and see Bon Jovi at Cardiff Arms Park when they were playing with Van Halen and Thunder and Crown of Thorns. That was a good one. And even at that time, I was sort of really aware that it was a bit uncool to like Bon Jovi in 1995. But it was an amazing show. And Thunder were insane because I was also quite into them as well. But I didn't really go to gigs because we couldn't really afford it. And I was too young, didn't have anyone to go with. And so it was just a lot of that weird period of not really feeling like I could fit in.
And it's also like before the internet as well, so you didn't have accessibility to, where did these bands go? You couldn't really figure it out because none of the mainstream press were covering them.
No, exactly. So what I'd have to do were two things. One was to go to the library where you could rent out tapes for 50p, and you just have to look at the front of the cover and go like, well, they look like the kind of band I might like. And the song names sound like the kind of song names I might like. Things like Rock Night and like Dying Without You, Crying to Find You, and like, really histrionic 80s rock names of things. And I'd be like, wow, I bet that's really good. Here's my 50p.
Around the same time, like 93, 94, I used to hire them from the library. Then about 2 years later, they'd have a big sale and all those cassettes were on sale for like £1 each. And I'd get the ones which I'd hired and it only had my stamp on it. I was the only one who actually hired them. So it's only ever me who'd actually listen to those tapes.
Yeah, I mean, not only because where were you at this time? Were you in Derby?
Yeah, Nottingham, Derby. So we still had Rock City.
Even so, it's not like you were living on the Sunset Strip. It was probably far and few between anyone who liked alternative music. And my first band that I had when I was 13 was right in the middle, of course, of that strange change over time. Do you remember when you had bands when you were that age? Everybody had a favorite band in the band. So you had like, inevitably, you had the Metallica guy, you had the Guns N' Roses guy, you had the Nirvana guy, and you had the Me guy, which was the 80s guy. And weirdly, you had this drummer who seemed to just be into jazz because he was the only drummer that anyone knew. And I joined this band, and the lead singer was absolutely obsessed with Nirvana, dressed like Kurt Cobain, and found out later that some of the riffs were actually ripped off of Nirvana riffs. But, we all did that. And the guitarist was 100% Metallica, and they were called Slaughter Machine. And so I joined Slaughter Machine, and even at that age, I thought, this is too cheesy. Can't be in a band called Slaughter Machine. So I said, guys, you've got to change the band name. I felt like I could just come in and say, right. Fortunately, they did. And they changed it because I was obsessed with the cult then. That was my middle of my real cult days. And I said, you just change it to Phoenix, which was cheesy in a different way, but just didn't seem quite so abrasive and like I couldn't say it to my mum. And Slaughter Machine, / Phoenix, we never did any gigs. We'd sort of practice in the bedroom, that sort of thing. And it never really went anywhere. But we did one rehearsal with a drummer that wasn't in the bedroom, that was in it's like in the sandwich room at a hospital or something. Really weird like that.
I always say that to people at that time when you were starting your first band, you'd be rehearsing in wherever you could, upstairs in a pub or a garage or something. Nowadays you've got all these plush rehearsal rooms which you can go to. And
it would be stuff like you turn up all excited after a week of school, like, yes, we're at the sandwich room, we're going to go and do this thing. And you turn up and there'd be someone there like, sorry, lads, I can't let you in there today. They're doing, and there's something would have gone wrong, and you've been looking forward to it all week. And so we went to the sandwich room and we were rehearsing with this drummer, and we started playing this riff. It was one written by the guitarist Khalil, and it went I was like, right, great, this is good. And then the drummer started, and he was like, it was like, what's happening? Why is he doing this like lounge drums to it? And he just wasn't a rock drummer. He just didn't have any idea, but he was the only one anybody knew. So we had to try and make it work.
Wow. You were waiting for like the big Tico Torres smashes to come in or something.
Not the case. But that was day in, day out of that kind of thing of you'd be so excited about something, you'd have these grand designs for it, and then like the reality of the resources that you had. But there were some good things that happened. Like, after I sort of technically even left the band, we just like drifted apart. It wasn't like some big, I'm leaving, this is it. I started jamming at school with a science teacher, or a physics teacher. I don't know how, but I heard that he was doing this like after school thing where you could go and jam, and like he had a ponytail and a leather tie, so he was really cool, Mr. Scott. And I guess at the time, he was probably like, I don't know, 26 or something, but he just seemed like so much older and like wiser and better and cooler. And he had like a guitar and an amp with distortion. And we go along with jam. And eventually it was me, I think I was like 14, 15 at that time. And the rest of them were sixth formers and Mr. Scott. And we sort of came up with this band. And it was one of those like weird amalgamations again, where it's that odd time where it's half grunge, half metal, half rap metal. The singer was massively into Rage Against the Machine and not really anything else. And Mr. Scott there's like still into like his 70s rock. And we actually were like moderately successful for a school band because we went on local television.
Is this the band Balanced State?
Yes. Yes, it is that. Yeah. Which terribly to begin with was called Clear as Mud, right? Which again, I rallied against that. So we came up with Balanced State, which is like one of those wonderful, doesn't really mean anything or say anything names, just really like inoffensive. And we went on local TV, and it was one of those like cable TV shows, and it was part of a competition. So you had 6 bands from the region who would go on and compete. And I can't remember if it was a voting thing by the audience or if there were judges or whatever. But the idea was that, well, there must have been more. There must have been like, I don't know, 30, 40 bands that went on the show, and then 6 got chosen for the big final. But actually getting to be on TV at that age was just so mind-blowing, and it was so exciting. And I couldn't even like get my parents to record it because we didn't have cable TV. So I had to get like the one friend I knew down the road to record it and watch it back. And I think that was like another real milestone point for me of those moments of realization. The first had been the Johnny Be Good in year 7. The second had been Balanced State on cable TV. And then we went to the final, which was in this big high school. And somehow we won this whole thing. And it was just mind blowing because it felt like we were in a movie. And I remember it so vividly, the moment they read out our name that we'd won. It was incredible. And the prizes were an amp, a day in a recording studio, and a gig. And we never did the gig. I don't know why, but we did this recording, which I found the other day, and it sounds so bad. It sounds like a live recording. I managed to contact some of the guys in the band from the back in the time and said, look, I found the tape and I've digitized it. And I sent it out to them. And they're like, wow, this is so cool to hear this. Are you sure this isn't live? No, this is a recording studio.
Is there evidence of the cable TV performance? Have you got a copy of that?
I wish there was. It was, I guess stuff like that they must have so much material, so much footage. They must just have to trash it all. But I have looked around a couple of times, but I've never seen it. But I would love to find that again.
So where does the band Aco come into the picture? Is that shortly after this?
Yeah, that's very shortly after that. It was the same sort of thing with Balanced State. I think we sort of found that point where people started leaving like school and things fell apart. And then there was this brief interim for maybe sort of 18 months or so where the dream came true. I was in a band with my Uncle Jonathan because I got to the point, I think we'd started playing around about the same sort of time. So we were about sort of as good as each other. And I was in a band with Uncle John, and his girlfriend at the time was the singer. It was a really cool band. It was called Disrupt. It was like, do you remember like Three Colors Red? And to some degree, the Senseless Things. Those were like real big influences on us. And it was this sort of power Brit rock punk, pop punk thing with a girl singer, very melodic. It was a bit like if Tank Girl was a band. That's kind of what it was like. It was really cool. And I really liked that band. That was where I really cut my teeth doing gigs, like actual gigs in venues, not just at school. We had some sort of moderate success in terms of we actually made a demo that was manufactured like multiple times and we sold them and stuff like that. And I think, again, that was just something that it was really important for me as a musician to do that. And it was where I really learned how to do backing vocals as well, because I'd be very heavily into the song songwriting side of it. So often I'd have come up with the melodies, so I'd be sort of showing them and singing them along, and harmonies and things. And so that was between the ages of about 16 and 19. We had some really catchy songs. It was good. Again, it was one of those things where I think they then got married, and I think their real life just sort of became, and their real jobs and things became more of the focus. And at that point, and they were just that much older than me.
How was the whole like live scene at that time?
When we were playing in places like the Fleece, which you met, Fleece and Firkin, which is an amazing Bristol venue, and then the Louisiana. We did a gig at a place called the Rummer, which was still the worst gig I've ever. Not the Rummer. It was the Fiddler and Firkin or something like that. God, it was awful, and it was nothing to do with the venue. It was us. It was because like just lack of preparation, I think, or just it was about 3 people there. That was a good start. I can remember the sound guy saying to me, "You're gonna have to turn your guitar down because there's no one here, no one here, no one here." And my guitar strap broke after like the first song, so I played all the set sitting on the stage, which is never a good look. And Uncle John, he'd like one of his strings was a semitone out of tune for the whole gig, like the worst out of tune you can possibly be. I think because of the low register and like the lack of monitoring, he just didn't notice. And again, you know, when you're that age, you're looking forward to this gig for sometimes months of this is the gig, and you've got your sort of friends and family there, like trying to not say it was bad by focusing on something else, like what a lovely venue this is and really great roof. And so yeah, we did a few gigs, and round about that time, I think again because they were in their early to mid 20s at that point.
So old.
I know, right? I became then caught up in the scene of people at college, because what happened is that I retook one of my A-levels because weirdly everyone got really badly marked that year, even though I remember getting really good predicted grades on English, which was my favorite subject. I'd predicted an A and I got a C, and I was like, I can't stand for this. Even if it takes a year out of my life, I'm going to get an A, because it was my best subject. And I'm not very good at like maths and science and languages, but I was always really good at English. So I really wanted that. And like lyrics and things, it was important to me. So I went and did a year in college, and there I met this whole ACO scene of people who were into this punk music, this sort of American and often like Scandinavian punk music. So I don't know how much you know about like Epitaph Records and Fat Records and those kind of bands. So like the main ones of those were bands that people remember would be like NoFX and The Offspring. But there were so many other great bands on those labels, like Strung Out and Melancholy, No Use for a Name, No Fun at All, Lagwagon. Like I got introduced to all these amazing bands who were both really great guitar bands and super melodic, and also was current. And I suddenly, for the first time, felt like I was part of something. And I genuinely loved the music because it did use like guitar riffs, and it was technical, and but it was also super melodic. And so that was where I met the ACO guys. And the other guitarist, Tom, was also into a lot of heavier stuff as well. So he was into like Stuck Mojo and Seven Dust, which is a band we got into very much together. And so it was like this amalgamation of these sort of heavy riffs, almost like Helmet kind of riffs, with this fast NoFX kind of punk side. And it was the first time, as I said, that there was a bunch of us in the college who were all into those bands, and we all massively bonded. And I sort of, at the same time, was still trying to keep Disrupt going, but it was naturally falling by the wayside. Whereas I'd felt that I really gelled with these new musicians. And that was where it all started. And we did our first demo in some like awful college studio for free or something. I remember we had this German sound engineer, and he said, right, you do each song twice and we choose the least bad. So it was the sort of the pep talk before we started playing. And he was right. We were bad. So bad, in fact, that at the end of one of the mixes, we had to like fade out the bass guitar because it was so badly played, but there wasn't time to re-record it. So we just fade it out. No one will notice. So that was the starting point of that band. And the first like EP that we did was a bit scrappy, but it showed promise. And we even got the singer of a punk band called Chaos UK come and sing on one of the songs. Just like little things like that. It was like, wow, this is exciting. And not long after that, we recorded our first EP, which was a 5-track thing called Fragments of Reason. And that was the real breakthrough for us, because we finally sort of found our sound. We mixed up these big riffs and this sort of down-tuned big riffs with these 80s kind of choruses, and it had elements of fast punk in it as well. So it was a really good amalgamation. And I remember we got this review from this American site called Punk Rocks Net, and I printed it out because I was like, this is the best thing anyone has ever said about anything I've been involved with. This guy was so into it, and he name-checked all these other great bands. Suddenly we realized that we had something that could actually go somewhere. It could go beyond our little town and our little lives. back then, someone from America.
Insane,
right? So we did our first record. We got signed to a Bristol label called Trash City, and we did our first record. And the cool thing was that our singer, Toby, had actually been in Kerrang already with a previous band of his called Headcase that had been this like super uber punk band, and they'd all been like 14, and they got 2 singles of the week. So we were already in a band with someone who had this pedigree. And I had my own pedigree that I'd come from this background of everyone always knew me as being like the guy who was a bit further ahead than everyone else guitar-wise of his age. And that'd been something that I'd really sort of carried with me. So I went into college. When I met these guys, it was like, I felt like I had some ground to stand on, that I could approach people like Toby and say, look, do you want to do something? And so we released this first album, which is called Find Yourself. And that was when like everything really changed for us. It was huge. And what happened was that we got like great reviews in Kerrang and Metal Hammer, 8 out of 10 and 4 out of 5 Ks and stuff. And I got a piece in Total Guitar magazine, like a whole page in Total Guitar magazine, which was really cool.
Was there like managers and stuff involved at this point?
Well, at that point, it was just the head of the label. And then really the label was just a bloke. And it was him doing a lot of this stuff for us. Simon Edwards, absolutely amazing guy, did so much great work for us. And what happened was that one of the other bands that we played on the scene with, turned out that he'd passed it on to his uncle, our album. Now, his uncle was Ralph Baker, who at the time was managing Jeff Beck and Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath, right? So Ralph heard this, he really liked it, and he had a meeting with us. And I remember that he met us in this pub that was like next door to our like local venue, and he was chatting to us about the band, and he ended up giving me one of Tony Iommi's old amps, because at the time I couldn't even afford an amp. I was borrowing one. So it was like, here's one of Tony's amps. Do you want it? Yes.
Wow.
And a few weeks later, he got a producer to fly in called Bob Marlette, who's done stuff like, I think he's done Alice Cooper and Rob Halford stuff. He did a band called Saliva. Bob Marlette came over from LA to meet us in our little pub, the Seven Stars, next to the Fleece and Firkin. And Bob there was talking about doing the second album with us. He was like, I love what you guys are doing. You got this dual guitar sound. It's really cool. This was absolutely mind-blowing. Imagine, so we're all there. We're all like 19, 20, 21 years old. And we've Tony Iommi's manager, Rob Halford's producer. What's happening? Just from this little album that we've done. And it was like super exciting. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is how it happens. And then, of course, unfortunately, things all fell apart. I mean, the principal reason, I think, was there was a couple of things. We played a really bad gig at the garage for various reasons. There were tensions within the band, and it was the usual thing of, I wanted us to be more melodic, Toby wanted us to be more heavy, the usual kind of clash that I'm sure happens in loads of bands. And as a consequence, we played this really bad gig at the garage where Ralph, this manager, had got like Sony and stuff to come and see us, and we just played really badly, and it was very embarrassing. And also, not long after that was September the 11th.
Wow.
Which meant that then Bob didn't want to come over and do the album.
Kind of messed all those ties up.
Yeah. And then like things very organically fell apart in the same way that they'd come together. But then we still had a couple of good years after that. We did a few more EPs, which were well received. We did a lot of good touring with Alkaline Trio, AFI, Stone Sour, Stiff Little Fingers once. And a few little UK tours as well. And we started to build up a name, and it was so exciting to go to like Nottingham or Leeds and have people turn up and know who you were and have your album and your t-shirts. And that was a really exciting new feeling.
Didn't that band take you to America at one point?
Yes, it did. Yes. We went to Texas to South by Southwest.
Had you been before?
I'd been once. I went once with the guitarist Tom just as a holiday, and that was like super exciting. And we went over there and we met guys from the Voodoo Glow Skulls. But yeah, South by Southwest. I won't explain to you the absolute drama that led into that because it's too long for this interview.
That's a whole nother dedicated podcast.
It is, yeah. The South by Southwest debacle. Basically what happened was that we went over there, and we, for whatever reasons, we were a man down. So we went over there with only one guitarist rather than two. And that was like a real last minute thing that had happened. And then just trying to navigate your way around as a band, that festival, and just the whole thing was really chaotic, and it just fell apart. And we before the actual show itself, it was one of those shows you want to bill with like 7 other bands, because the whole thing is like running for an entire week, and there's like a billion venues and a billion bands. So we're on the bill with 7 other bands, and we're on first, right? And I think some of the other bands that were playing were Open Hand and Juliana Theory. I remember that. And we were on first, and we had no idea what we were going to do about gear share, because we're just like guys going over on a plane. We can't take all our gear or anything. So what the stage manager said to me, emailed to me, it said, right, you're going to have to phone up these guys in Sweden and these guys in Calgary or whatever, and find out if you can borrow their stuff.
So there's no like a static backline or anything like that?
No. So I'm like phoning up Sweden. phoning up these guys in like Gothenburg saying, and like finally get hold of them. Guys, you don't even know who I am, but can we use your amps? And it's like, well, we don't really know what amps we're going to use. So we'll see you there. So when you get there and you've got that, like, you're super nervous because you don't know what the backline's going to be. We've got like a 12-second sound check and everything, and all the gear was falling apart. And the whole thing just was really chaotic. But the one cool thing about it at the end was that the manager at the time said to me, he said, look, because I'd worked really hard with the manager to make it happen, to organize. And it was almost like me and him co-managing it. And he said to me, look, I think you'd really do well in London. I think you need to move there and meet people who are a bit more like-minded to yourself. And maybe we can do something together there. So that was when I moved out there. I think I spent a couple of months writing some songs for myself and recording them at a friend's studio. Then those were going to be my like showcase songs of, I'm going to go to London. These are going to be my songs, and I'll try and make a band from this work. And that was sort of one other thing I forgot to mention about ACO was we also did a Radio 1 session, which was like one of the most amazing experiences of my life at Maiden with the Lockup. And again, it was one of those things where to be in that place and the artists who'd been there and to actually be on Radio 1 was insane. So that was another real highlight.
Very cool. What year was that?
2002.
Nice. So once you move into London, shortly after you get the Sisters of Mercy gig and you do your bands Night by Night and your current band Diamond Black, they all hold melodic elements of the bands you grew up with, but with perhaps a harder hedge. But you've also been an integral part of the Shot Through the Heart night in London, playing the hard rock and hair metal stuff. Has there ever been a temptation to go on full bubblegum rock with a project?
I know what you're saying, and I think I sort of got that element out in the Shot Through the Heart aspect. There have been times where I've talked to the other members about what if we did an originals band. I just think ultimately, I mean, you know how hard it is to do an originals band. You don't just do it. There's so much time, and I just didn't think it was yet worthwhile pursuing that. And there were enough elements of my 80s roots in the bands that I was doing to keep me satisfied, I think.
Gotcha. Is there an album from back in that day that you still go to and it still sounds great?
Well, it's funny because you could listen to stuff now, like from the perspective of now, and you can actually hear the flaws and the holes in it that as a kid you didn't hear for a number of reasons. One being that the production quality that you're listening to it is usually better rather than like a tape that you recorded off your mate. And also that you're hearing it maybe with fresh ears, and without that, sometimes that element as a kid that you just hold people in such high regard that you think they can do no wrong. And then you listen now, you're like, actually that bass is really out of tune, or those backing vocals aren't right.
What is Ricky Rocket playing on that? It's all over the place.
Well, exactly.
Playing his own song. Yeah, and I love him.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a few albums I think that really stand up, and often I think it's the more stripped down ones that do. Like, say, The Cult's Electric, which is very stripped down as an album. That still stands up really well. Appetite for Destruction, even though I'm not a massive Guns fan, I think that just still sounds really killer. It's just an organic attitude to it that transcends the years, and it's still cool. It's one of the few albums from 1987 that's still cool. 88, 87.
I'm still the same. I was never a fan of like the, if you want to call it the, there's like a group of bands like Guns N' Roses, Faster Pussycat, LA Guns, which they're all right, but I seem to gravitate more towards your Poisons and Danger Dangers. But I totally get where those GNR kind of bands are so loved and adored. And like you say, Appetite for Destruction, there is something, it just sounds just so honest and just so rock and roll. It's undeniable.
Clear comparison there. If you listen to Screw It, Danger Danger, which I absolutely love that album, it sounds quite dated because it's using all those like 80s tropes of everything's like super tuned in time, compressed and perfect. And I love that record, but it sounds dated. Whereas Appetite still has that kind of almost like coming out of the speakers ballsiness to it that makes it stand up. I still prefer the Danger Danger album, but you could see why people venerate certain albums back then so well. And I think, I'm trying to think of some other ones, but I think Priest's Painkiller is still very, very strong. And I think people still go to that as a mainstay of one of the greatest metal albums of all time, because it's the perfect balance of songwriting, production and execution as well. And I'm always like a bit torn over Hysteria because it's one of my favorite albums of all time. It's like so massively produced. It's made its own genre.
Yeah.
Therefore you can't really judge it other than on its own merit. Like super produced, but that's what those songs needed.
It's just something totally on its own, I think, Hysteria.
Yeah,
It's just like that larger than life, untouchable thing. You either get it or you don't.
Absolutely.
How far down the rabbit hole have you gone on the Shot Through the Heart nights? How diverse have you gone?
Well, we've always tried to find like a balance of playing the big hits that, you know, everyone's going to hear when they're drunk. But even so, we've never played Sweet Child of Mine. We never played Highway to Hell. There was a certain like no list. You're never going to play The Final Countdown, but we will play Rock the Night. And we always try to find that balance of playing songs that everyone really loves, but maybe haven't heard live very often. Like we would bring out things like Aerosmith Crying or Bon Jovi In These Arms, like songs that everyone knows, but they just didn't expect you to play. And I think we'd really delight in that. And then we'd also make sure that in the first half of the set, we chucked in a few like pretty obscure ones like Lynch Mob, Gorky Park, stuff like that. And we've done Danger Danger, we've done Firehouse, and we've done the Firehouse songs that aren't the obvious singles as well. And it's just like finding that balance of we'll play stuff like Harem Scarum and Hardline, but then it'll be backed up with like a Wasp song. So then if people have sort of wandered off to the bar because they don't understand what you're playing, they still sit in the room and they still come back. And then it sort of played a dual purpose of creating an exciting party vibe whilst there being those real kind of deep cut, stalwart people who absolutely adore the genre and can't believe that you're actually playing that song by Femme Fatale or something. And come up and afterwards the absolute delight that you actually bothered to look that deeply into the genre.
I love it, mate. I love it. Well, Ben, thank you ever so much, mate. I'll let you go. I could natter about all this rubbish for hours.
Thanks, man. Thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And it's exciting and fun to talk about this stuff. I really feel like I've sort of stepped out of my normal world for an hour or so. It's been really fun. So thank you.
Big shout to Ben Christo for a really, really fun chat. It was great to talk to someone so enthusiastic about the music I love to this day and to see someone having such great success in the rock industry. As mentioned, check out diamondblackofficial.com to keep up to date with Ben's music, and also please keep spreading the word about the Straight to Video podcast too. I have a dedicated website for the podcast close to being launched in the next few weeks, so I'll be updating all my social media with links to that in the very near future, and I'm very excited to get that out there. But as always, you guys are the very, very best. I really love doing this and love that you're enjoying it too. So until next time, please look after yourselves and we'll speak again real soon.